Welcome to everyone who is currently in the Zoom meeting. Currently joining us all, we've got current members of the Philosophy, Politics, and Economics Society. We have alumni members of the Philosophy, Politics, and Economics Society, as well as students from my own Economic Analysis of Political Decision-Making class, as well as Professor Schneider and some of his students. What is the course title for your class, Rich?
It's Models of Excellence in Comparative Research.
Excellent. But we're joined today by author and scholar James Scott, author of books such as The Art of Not Being Governed, Seeing Like a State, as well as Against the Grain. And for those who are unfamiliar, the Philosophy, Politics, and Economics Society at Brown University, sponsored by the Political Theory Project, we tend to read and discuss things within a given theme over the course of a semester. And this theme this semester we've been discussing statelessness, self-governance, and naturally, in light of COVID-19 and the coronavirus, we've sort of changed gears to asking questions about how stateless environments cope with and engage in responding to crisis, and in particular, the question of pandemic disease. And interestingly enough, this was a key topic in some of the writings that Professor Scott has produced in the past. And so I don't want to take up too much more time. And so I propose that we turn it over to Professor Scott for his preliminary comments.
Sure. I wanted to start by saying that it seems to me a shame that the role of disease in history is not given more the prominence that it deserves. It seems to me the ancient plagues, the Justinian plagues and so on, when sort of commerce in the Mediterranean got underway, were some of the most significant events in Greek history. Thucydides writes a lot about infectious disease that destroys the Athenian attack on Syracuse. And then you have these huge pandemics, the Justinian plague, and I forget the second plague. And then in the Middle Ages, of course, in the middle of the 14th century, you have the Black Plague that kills, people estimate, between a third and a half of the European population. And forms of the people who study these things notice that for those people who were lucky enough to have survived it, serfdom became a lot easier for the people who were left because there was a shortage of labor. And so you couldn't understand the next century and a half of medieval history without the vast decrease in population of the serf population. And it's also coincides in Eastern Europe with the so-called second serfdom, in which, not wanting to lose the serfs, they decided to clamp down and prevent them, from the few who remained, from running away. So I think one of the great books of this kind, by the way, is William McNeill's book called Plagues and People, if you're interested in that. And another book is Charles Mann's book, which some of you may know, called 1491, which is everything we know about the pre-Columbian world before Columbus landed. And we also know that probably 80% of the population of the New World died of diseases to which they had no inherited immunity, European diseases, essentially. And so you can't write the history of the New World without this incredible total collapse, demographic collapse, that had to do with the transmission of disease. So I don't propose to write a book about disease and history, but one of you should anyway. It seems to me to be an enormously important topic that is kind of not understood. I mean, and it's too bad that when people do go back, they go back to the 1918 Spanish flu. And there's so much more to be understood about disease. So I wanted that was a kind of introductory thing about the literature and the importance of infectious diseases. I wanted to say that for me, the two books that I have read about the plague are the fictional account by Albert Camus called La Peste, and I recommend it to you. It's the great book of who and how you understand existentialism and who's an existential hero. And it's based on a certain knowledge of an outbreak of the plague in Algeria. If you haven't read it, it should be, it's a great experience. The other book is Daniel Defoe's Journal of the Plague Year. I think in 1665, 1666. I'm confused because much of London burned down one of those years. And one was the plague year and the other was a big fire. And I get them confused. But in any case, I had the idea before I read Daniel Defoe that plagues were democratic in the sense that they took lives more or less irrespective of your wealth, your social condition, your class, your status, and so on. And Daniel Defoe's actual account of that plague year was an education for me, because like the plague we have now, the dying was demographically calibrated by class and income, so that the wealthy people tended to escape the plague, and the poorest people in London failed to escape it. One of the reasons was, it's perfectly obvious for those of you who live in, as you do now in, or did anyway, in Rhode Island, is that the first thing that wealthy people did at the first sign of the plague is they went to their country houses and, away from London. They ran away right away. People are running away here to Maine and other places. I have relatives who have a hunting cabin in central Pennsylvania. They're holed up in central Pennsylvania. And so people with second homes, if you like, have a place to run to. Oxford and Cambridge had plague houses. And at the first sign of plague in Oxford or Cambridge historically, the students were sent to these little cottages dotted throughout the countryside and didn't come back until after the plague was over. The people who couldn't run away, if they were relatively well-to-do, they locked themselves in their apartment and sent one servant to do all the running around for their basic needs. Some of them got the plague brought to them by their servant along with the groceries. But many of them escaped, and the poor who couldn't leave London and who had to do, if you like, dangerous chores, just the way poor Black and Hispanic and poor people have to do now, were the people who suffered most from the plague. So for me, it was an education, and it all had to do with how you could get away from the disease, put distance between yourself and the disease, and go to a sparsely populated, isolated area. This is also the case with Aboriginal people historically. So I came across in the middle of the, as the COVID-19 hit Malaysia, I've done some, historically, I've done a lot of work in Malaysia. And the so-called Orang Asli are called Aboriginal population. They're not really Aboriginal, but they're mountain dwellers. And many of them live close to the plains because that's where the economic opportunities were. And the moment the COVID epidemic broke out, they all ran back to the mountains. The higher in the topography, the better. And they blocked the roads coming into the mountains. They've been doing this for 1,000 years. They know that when there's an epidemic in the plains, that they've got to get away. And historically in central Luzon, when there was a plague in the rice-growing, crowded areas, the mountain people would also block the trails into the mountains so that no one could come in and wall themselves out and kill anyone who tried to run away to the mountains themselves. So what's interesting is that there is a deep, deep historical knowledge and understanding of the way in which the way in which to escape a plague is to get yourself out of crowds and urban conglomerations. And in this case, they were, in a sense, the very poorest mountain people were in the same position as people with second homes, ironically, and they could run away to the mountains and seal themselves off. One other historical example, one of my heroes whom I quote in The Art of Not Being Governed is a French anthropologist named Pierre Clastre. And he was the first person, he was an anthropologist in South America, French anthropologist. And there were these groups that were understood to be Stone Age people, the Siriano, the Yanomamo, and the Guarani. And they were all assumed, they were hunters and gatherers and foragers. And it was assumed that they were too dim-witted to have ever invented agriculture, and that they were a true Stone Age people, so that we could understand what Stone Age people were like, because these were Stone Age people in a world in which agriculture already existed. One of the suppositions of Pierre Clastre was that these people knew agriculture and became hunters and gatherers and foragers in order to get away from the Spanish settlements that they associated with disease and forced labor. And so these Spanish settlements, by the way, were called reducciones. That is to say, the concentration of the population. If you're thinking concentration camp, right? It is, you know, packing people in who were growing crops and so on for the Spanish settlement. So they understood not only was there forced labor in the Spanish settlements, but this, if you like, crowding of a population was a crowding of population that for them, not having the immunities that the Spanish, acquired immunities that the Spanish had, these were often deadly diseases to them, things that we pay very little attention to these days, like measles and chickenpox and mumps and so on. His supposition was, and it's been more or less confirmed by subsequent research, is that these people, if you like, stepped back a rung of civilization to hunting and gathering and foraging, as it was generally understood, and they did it for their own safety. So they, if you like, went back to a form of subsistence that would protect them against these diseases of crowding. And I think I thought I would go then to the question of the history of infectious diseases. In public health parlance, infectious diseases are called, I think, community-acquired infections. And that is, it signals the question, the point of person-to-person transmission and crowding. And so it's relatively simple that these diseases are diseases that spread best when you have a lot of the same species together, crowded in clumps of population that are very populous. That is, the closer they are together, the more dangerous it is. The more that it's the same species, in our case, Homo sapiens, but it could be buffalo, it could be antelope, it could be gazelles, it could be whatever. That is, it's the, and it, those, for those of you who've read Seeing Like a State, it starts off with scientific forestry and the fact that scientific industrial forestry often had whole forests of the same species of tree, and these trees were incredibly vulnerable to plant diseases, to tree diseases, because the things that ate them, or funguses that destroyed them, or beetles that ruined their inner bark, they would go from one tree to another because it was all their favorite food. So biodiversity is one of the things that prevents epidemics from happening. That is to say, if you have a forest of 60 or 70 different species of trees scattered among one another, there may be something that will hit one kind of tree, but if the next tree, if you like, same species tree isn't close to it, it probably will not make it. And so traditional gardens, I'm diverting a little bit. Well, the interesting thing about the American garden or the European garden that is crazy, truly crazy, is that we line them up like regiments of soldiers, and we have the same species in a big row. And so if anything wants to attack that plant, they have a buffet from one end of the road to the other of the stuff that they like. And many, many traditional gardens in Guatemala and so on are this incredible combination of different plants scattered among one another, because they understood that they're less vulnerable to crop diseases and rusts and funguses and so on. So the principle of concentration and genetic similarity are, if you like, the key elements in making possible epidemics of infectious diseases. And the thing that since you've read some of it, I won't capitulate it much, but the thing that surprised me, and the thing that I think was most of the stuff in Against the Grain is stuff that I plundered from the archaeologists and the historians and so on. Is not much original. I try to put it together in an original way, but it's nothing new that I've invented there. The thing that's slightly original, I think, is this idea that it became clear to me that these community-acquired infections are a product of civilization. That is, it's not that these infectious diseases were things that hunters and gatherers, and for 185,000 years, our species has been hunters and gatherers and marine collectors and so on, in small bands. And it's not that these infectious diseases were rare. They did not exist at all. They are diseases that were brought into being by the combination of large numbers of people being brought together in concentrations that were 20, 25 times, 30 times greater than the world had ever seen for the last 180,000 years. And they were together with a similar crowding of domesticated animals, so that almost all of the early infectious diseases were diseases that moved between domesticated animals and human beings. That's why we call chicken pox, cow pox, and so on, right? I think Jenner, the inventor of the vaccination against smallpox, realized that he didn't have to vaccinate the people, the girls who helped on the farm, because they had already been in close proximity to cowpox and had the antibodies against it. And instead, he tried the vaccination on his own children who hadn't spent time with the cows. So that almost all of these infectious diseases can be traced to camels, to horses, to pigs, to cattle, to sheep, and so on, to dogs as well, and to things that we don't think of domesticated animals, but they're things that came in big concentrations to early agriculture because of all the grain that was there. And those are the rats and mice, what we call the sort of obligate pests, the things that thrive in the same ecological setting as agriculture does. And so now I'm just talking about how the diseases came to infect human beings. But in fact, I always say, I've given some talks on this, that if I were a goat, I would have a different story to tell about how humans gave us diseases, right? It's not diseases were going both ways, from the domesticated animals to us and from us to domesticated animals. And what we need is an articulate goat to lay this out and make the charges against us. Let's see. The question of quarantine is also a very early thing. I mean, in dealing with the earliest crowded places in Mesopotamia, it was interesting to me that when a disease broke out in the palace, everyone understood that the people who were first identified with a disease, didn't always work, of course, they were, if you like, walled in and not permitted out. And everyone was forbidden to touch the cups and bowls and eating implements and clothes and bed linen that they had. So everyone understood, without knowing the details about germs and bacteria, let alone viruses, that this was transmissible, and you didn't want to be in close proximity to them, and you didn't want to touch all the things that they had. It was also understood completely that armies that came back, even your own army, would almost certainly carry disease. Often it was cholera. And so even a triumphant army, when it came back in Mesopotamia, was commanded to stop something like 10 miles outside the city, take off all their clothes and armor and burn it, and walk into the city naked. The idea was that they would then get rid of the infections. And you're all familiar with the lazaretti, that you can still find them in Italy and other places. That is whenever a ship arrived and it was suspected of carrying disease, like, what is it called? What's the famous ship? The Princess, help me out. There's something Princess, Diamond Princess, right? That if a ship were expected to have a disease, they would be in effect quarantined in the lazaretti for something like 40 days. So the word quarantine is quarente. It comes from 40 days that you have to be held before they'll let you out, because they think either the disease has already killed you or you now have immunity from it. So people understood, if you like, they understood the elementary things about quarantine disease, about fleeing the source of the infection. I don't think they understood about washing hands, because even surgeons didn't understand that until toward the end of the 19th century, and transmitted infections to lots of people. Let me stop there, and I'm happy. I've concentrated on the epidemiology just because it's topical, and we're all in quarantine. But I'm happy to take questions about anything else that you've read, and any charges or accusations that you'd like to make.
Professor Scott, thank you so much for the preliminary comments. For all of you guys in the chat, last time we used the system where you click on the hand raising icon, and then I'll call upon you before you turn your mic on and propose a question to Professor Scott. I'll start us off. Professor, I posed a similar question to—
Would you call me Jim?
Sure, Jim, sorry. I posed a similar question to David Friedman, who had worked on a number of different sort of case studies in statelessness. But it was heavily inspired by your discussions in The Art of Not Being Governed. The concept of shatter zones that you lay out in that text, and you reiterated a bit in your comments here that this exile, this sort of fleeing from the threat, in the text, it had an enduring effect that, especially between the dynamic of the government and the people who were sort of disaffected by government action. So indigenous people got genocided, they flee from the state centers. So that brings to mind a lot about trust and the difficulty of rebuilding that trust. And you mentioned that the effects of COVID seem to be very class structured. And I'm curious if you have any thoughts about how this event and or the reactions and resources of coping with this event might shape community trust across different groups of people in our contemporary society.
Can I ask, I want to inquire, is your point that this experience has damaged that trust, and how is it to be reestablished, or that it, I'm not sure.
Well, I guess in my perception, it seems like some environments are going to have improvements in trust or sustained or elevated levels because they're going to think that their local leaders did good things. And in other environments, there might be worsened trust. So it seems like apart from just class divides, that there's something to be said about devout religious communities seem to have less willingness to comply with the sort of governmental edicts of how to respond to COVID. So we're seeing Hasidic Jewish communities in New
Right.
York, and some devout Christian sects are sort of ignoring the stay-at-home attitudes. And I'm wondering just like how you think that dynamic might play out.
I'm not sure I have anything particularly original to offer in that respect. It's interesting, I suppose, that acts of solidarity or performances of solidarity that require the believers or community or whatever you want to call it to gather regularly, if that is, if you like, if that performative aspect of togetherness, whether it's commensuality or whatever, is at the core of the religion, they are not likely to give it up easily. And I suppose the only thing one can ask is to inform them carefully about the dangers that they run by this behavior, not just to themselves, but to the larger community in general. And then if they choose, and I suppose, in some societies, one would just wall them in and shoot anyone who tried to leave. And it's certainly true that in The Art of Not Being Governed, one of the reasons why people ran away was because of disease, right? Was at the first sign of disease. And so actually in Mesopotamia, there are lots of little civilizations that last for 40, 50 years, and then they suddenly disappear. We don't know why they disappeared. The little town is not burned down. There's no evidence when you have cuneiform in the written record that there was a war. My guess is that a lot of these were emptied by epidemics and people ran away. Maybe most of the people saved their lives, for all I know. So it's not as if they just all died. But so I, what was I going to say about trust? I mean, it seems to me, speaking as the little political scientist in me, would, which I haven't completely repressed. It seems to me that it is the trust that needs to be rebuilt is with those communities who have those high exposure jobs, who are poor or homeless or in prisons, and have to run around and do chores, in addition to the frontline healthcare workers that everyone talks about. But it seems to me that by not having had the tests, by not having given them the gear, that we've shown them that we don't have their backs, right? And I hope that there are consequences to that politically in terms of universal health care and so on. I know it could go the other way, but it seems to me that the people who've been betrayed by this are the people who don't live in the country and have a barn that they can go to, like me.
First on the queue is Ava Rosenbaum.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. Well, thank you so much for coming. I wanted to ask, like, during the current pandemic, we've heard a lot of conspiracy theories that either governments have made this disease or Bill Gates or what have you. I want to ask, historically, have we seen similar trends of conspiracy theories, or is that a new phenomenon?
Oh, what an interesting question. What I'm sure is that it's not a new phenomenon. It seems to me, so when there is, I'm going to make a generalization that I'm happy to be corrected for, but it seems to me that when you have something that is terrifying, that could kill you, and you don't know much about it, then the absence, and in this case, even for people who are paying attention and don't have a conspiracy theory that they want to peddle, but even for ordinary people, something of this level of personal danger is and fear, in the absence of real knowledge about how to stay safe and so on, is a vacuum into which all kinds of rumors, right, fall. And so people are grasping at straws. Hydrochloride, I forget the malarial medicine, chloroquine. The idea that this or that, right? People are grasping at all these things because they have no other information, and so the degree to which the fear and absence of firm knowledge, its consequence is to make a field for rumor. And of course, and I'm talking about rumor that you don't have to see any malevolent motives behind it. There are lots of rumors that have malevolent motives, that want to sell you something, right, and so on. I understand that, but it seems to me that we're all liable to rely on rumors. I mean, in wartime, it happens all the time when people don't know what's happened, whether a town has fallen or not, whether they're in danger, whether the enemy is coming, and so on. In the absence of real news, you keep your ear to the ground and grab everything you possibly can. So,
Next on the queue, I have Emily Scarbeck.
I apologize if my mic is a little fuzzy. Thank you so much for your comments and for being here with us today. I'm really excited to have this conversation. You started your comments by talking about how humans as a species have this kind of deep historical knowledge of plagues and pestilence and these types of events. And it's often argued that the kind of deep historical knowledge allows us as a human species to develop norms to either protect against these types of events, or at least to be robust in the face of these types of events. And I'm curious if you think that there's anything like that within our kind of cultural toolkit, so to speak. And if not, is it because
within our cultural what?
Within our cultural toolkit, our baggage. And if not, is it because these events just happen too infrequently, generationally speaking, to be able to develop those types of robustness?
It's interesting. It's it's something that I've thought about a little bit anyway, without ever having written anything about it. Of course, our toolkit contains a tremendous amount of written history. So it's not as if, right, we couldn't find this out. It's not as if this is opaque and unavailable to us. What's interesting, of course, is that it's not part of the toolkit of the ordinary person, and for perfectly understandable reasons. But if you have an oral culture and you have myths and legends, so for example, I don't know if you remember there was a tsunami in Sumatra and Aceh that killed, I think, 100,000 or more people. This was sort of about 10 years ago, I guess. Someone can correct me about the date. What is interesting is that there are a group of marine harvesters called sea gypsies in parts of Burma, and they actually live on their boats. They're kind of, instead of running to the hills with colonialism and states, they kind of ran to the water, and they live off their boats and spend the time collecting stuff on beaches and sea urchins and so on. Anyway, a group of these people who had stopped at an island that's one of their, if you're rotating island stays for a few days, they noticed that the tide went out further than they had ever remembered. And the old people said, oh my God, we must run to the hill. The hill was only about 25, meters high, right? But they understood when the tide goes out that there's a tsunami coming, and no one had any experience of this personally. And the grandfathers didn't, grandmothers didn't have any experience of this in person, but they had the legend, and they remembered that when the tide goes out like you've never seen it before, there's going to be a huge wave of water. And they were all safe because they quickly ran to the high ground that they had available to them. And what's interesting to me is that they had a more effective memory by being an oral culture than we seem to have by being a written culture. Right?
Next on the queue, we have Ryan Frant.
Hi, Professor Scott. First,
Hi.
thank you for being able to speak today. I'd like to ask you a question about your book, Seeing Like a State, specifically about how the state forms, because you document, local resistance to the state being able to, execute measures to make the local culture legible. So I wanted to ask you, I guess, how does the state even form if local actors are always resisting the state's tactics? Do you think it's a story of I guess, stationary and roving bandits, or is there something else, or how do you approach that as an anthropologist?
Oh, I'm of course, because everyone, uh, the story of the creation of states, or the creation of, let's say, large concentration of peoples that make a state possible, not necessary, but possible. Um, the and I don't talk about this because it's the standard story that, in fact, when you get, let's say, in the ancient world, you get an area that is advantageous in terms of the trade of things that can take place there, that the ecology is good for growing things, that there are many different sort of ecotones available for different kinds of collecting at certain times of the year. This was true of the lower Mesopotamia, of the Tigris-Euphrates Valley, incidentally. That when there's not disease, when there's not war, when there's not oppressive taxes, these are advantageous places to be. And so they are likely to become more crowded. They're likely to have forms of governance having to do with trade and dealing with people who are crazy or dangerous and so on. And eventually then you get something that looks like a state, often with a king. And then if the king wants to collect regular taxes, they have to start counting. They have to start counting, the grain, the granaries. They have to start counting the sheep. They have to start counting all the things that they might want to tax. And therefore you get that kind of projects of legibility, which is an effort to, so the state can grow up at times of peace and trade in a way that's fairly organic. The fact is, it never continues to exist exactly that way. And all those early states, they seldom last for more than a reign or two reigns of kings, because either the taxes get so onerous that people run away, or the trade disappears, the trade route changes. There is, and by the way, I should add that the kinds of disease arguments that I was making earlier are true for crops as well. That when you get a field of wheat or a field of oats or a field of rice, of all pretty much genetically similar members of the same species, the possibility of having a crop disease and therefore a kind of crop failure and famine is much more likely than it would be if your subsistence depended on many, many different products gathered from different parts of the ecology. Is that helpful?
Yeah, that makes sense. Thank you.
Next
I
up,
mean, I don't think that, I guess the point is that you don't, what I try to deal with stateness in the art of not being governed as not it's not as if there's a state or there's not a state, but stateness is a continuum in which, if it has a king and walls and a castle and specialists and tax collectors and an army, it's a fucking state, right? If it doesn't have many of those things, right, or only a few of them, it may be on its way to being a state, or it's a partial state. And so it's like a continuum from 0 to 100, if you like, and things are more or less state-like rather than being a state or not a state.
next on the queue, I've got Rich Schneider.
Can you hear me? I think I unmuted myself. Good to have you here, Jim. Thanks for
Sure.
being with us. Two questions. First, informational issue. You gave the example, I think it was the central Luzon valleys in Malaysia, where folks would head to the hills and wall off the roads and so forth when they became aware that a plague or an epidemic was occurring. And what do we know, of anything, about how information spread, was generated about there being a plague or not being a plague? I mean, I'm sort of curious how, before modern information technology, people learned about plagues and epidemiological threats. The second question, you told the story, rightly so, because it's a theme of the course, I gather, without states, sort of plagues in the time without states. And that's not the time that we live in, obviously. So just some broad reflections, if you might offer them, on what the difference is between experiencing an epidemic with a state as opposed to without a state. And I think that would be helpful to hear.
Okay, there's several things I'd like to say. It's a provocative question, and and it goes back to this question of rumors and conspiracy theories. You know, in a world without newspapers and without NPR and without Fox News, but in a world without
no Zoom either, no Zoom
without Zoom, exactly. That in fact, rumors are, if you like, news transmitted from mouth to mouth, right? And some of that news is correct and some of it's not correct. And so someone hears that a whole bunch of people have died mysteriously in a village and tells it to someone in the next village and the next village, and people remember that this happened a long time back and a lot of people died and I better get out of here, right? That's a rumor that functions like a newspaper and actually probably saves some people's lives. And so when we think about rumors, it's not, rumor ought not to be equated with fake news. It may be, but it doesn't have to be fake news. And in fact, rumor, or if you like, mouth-to-mouth news in a world without writing is in fact the way in which any information is communicated. So everything, if you like, is a rumor unless you witnessed it personally yourself. This question of remind me of the second part of your question, Richard.
Yeah, let me put it this way. If you had a choice between living in a world with states as opposed to one without states, in which a plague or epidemic is being introduced, which world would you rather live in and why?
Well, okay, so whether you have a state or not, it just so happens that if you're crowded and have no way of avoiding the crowding, then you better goddamn well have a state that knows what it's doing that can help to contain an epidemic. But if you are dispersed and you live a life, as we did for most of our species history, in small bands, you don't have these diseases. So, for example, there's the epidemiological thing. It's somewhere in that chapter. I think that it's an example that epidemiologists use often. That it's the Faroe Islands that had a small population, and some Danish sailor came in the 18th century and brought measles, and everybody got measles. A lot of people died, and those people who didn't die had lifetime immunity, and there was no more measles in the Faroe Islands because there was no one carrying it, right? Either died or immune. And then later on, there are like 3 episodes of this, but let's say in the second episode, 30 years later, another Danish sailor gets off a boat with measles. And everybody under 30 has no immunity. And everybody over 30 doesn't get it, right? And so everybody under 30 gets it. Some of them die, some of them don't die, and it disappears again. So here's, if you like, you have to have a certain, and it is dependent on the infectivity of the disease, on the length of time during which it's transmitted, and in which you are infectious, and its degree of lethality, that you can actually, epidemiologists can tell you the size of the population you have to have so that it's always a reservoir. We call these endemic diseases. We have them all the time, but they turn out to be relatively harmless, and they're diseases of childhood by and large. And so the only thing I would care about in terms of infective diseases is I'd like to live, if I'm in danger, I want to live in tiny little groups that are below the floor for the community carrying of infections. Because those infectious diseases were, from the time of the early civilizations, the most important cause of death for the next several millennia. All right.
Next on the queue, we have David Scarbeck.
Thank you very much for being here with us today. I'm in the political science department at Brown, but I was originally trained in economics. And so I have sort of two questions about how your work dovetails with approaches in economics. Maybe they're a little pedestrian, but I guess I was curious if you have any familiarity with the sort of positive economic analysis of anarchy in that literature. You know, have you read any of it? Do you have any thoughts on it relative to sort of more traditional anarchist thinkers? And the second is in Seeing Like a State.
I'm sorry, who are you referring to?
Well, we spoke with David Friedman a few weeks ago, and he would be one example. But there's other sort of younger anarchists.
Is this the son of Milton?
It is, yes.
Well, he's an anarcho-capitalist. Right?
Yeah, that's the sort of literature. I'm curious what your sort of thoughts on it.
Well, I mean, yeah, okay, I can. I had a debate with him at Trinity College. Actually, it was kind of fun. And what's interesting to me is that you know, there's a sort of, it's not as if I don't have some aspects of libertarianism right in my own work, but the thing that struck me about David Friedman is that he has not the slightest problem of any disparity in income, life chances, accumulated wealth, political power. He doesn't see that as a problem at all. And it seems to me that that's just crazy. And I'd say it to his face. It's not as if I'm doing it behind his back. That, you know, how can you, for market fundamentalists like that, you know, in the interwar period, starving Chinese mothers sold their children in order to have a meal. Well, you know, for market fundamentalists, they didn't have to sell their child. They could have starved, right? So they made a choice, right? They had free will. But anybody who looks at that, who doesn't understand that it's the coercive situation of life chances and food supply, et cetera, right? So if you can look past that, it seems to me you're sort of ethically completely obtuse. And so that kind, the kind of libertarianism that doesn't, not that it's, you know, I understand, and David Friedman could have taken me to task on that, which is the question of how do you deal with disparities in income without a strong state, right? So the question of how you deal with that without a strong state is a worthwhile question for a long seminar. Your second question.
Well, it was in one review I read of Seeing Like a State by an economist at Berkeley. He says that there's actually strong analogies between the problems in Seeing Like a State and the Hayekian knowledge problem. And I was curious, his name is escaping me at the moment, but I'm curious if you sort of see any overlap in those sort of conceptual problems.
If someone, I was long before you were born. I was an undergraduate at Williams in political economy, and we read Hayek's Road to Serfdom, along with Barbara Ward's Defense of Socialism. Right, and I remember it. I remember it well. And if anybody told me that I would have had a nice word to say about Hayek then, right, I would have probably shot them if I was armed. And the fact is that one of the things, it seems to me, is that how do you put it? Certain problems of coordination and exchange and transactions are so complicated that they can't be handled by any algorithm we have. And, you know, market distribution of certain things is the only logical way to go. My best analogy, and actually it's Michael Oakeshott, a conservative political philosopher, makes this point as well, that I like to think of this as the question of language. That is, all of the Académie Française that tried to legislate language and grammar, and the grammarians that want, right? The fact is that everybody is free, including hip hop artists and so on, to contribute to the language and to the slang. And if we like it, we pick it up. So it's not as if everybody is equal in contributing to that language. Don't get me wrong. But the fact is that it is relatively open, right, in terms of innovations in the language, and sometimes innovations in how we speak and our expressions and so on come from places that are not places of privilege and wealth and so on. So there's something about the democracy of the way in which a spoken language, not a written language, but a spoken language is created, that seems to me, that's a sort of, it's a Hayekian point, but made better by Michael Oakeshott in terms of his argument. Michael Oakeshott's argument is language is changing all the time. It's not as if we conservatives are against change. It's just that it's piecemeal change that is stochastic and aggregated over time.
Next on the queue is Glenn Yu.
Hi, thank you so much, Professor Scott. So there are two of us here. We actually each have questions, if that's okay.
Of course not. You'll each have to ask a half a question.
All right. I was curious, given all the different questions you've kind of researched over the course of your career, if you were starting out in academia again today, what do you think are the projects you would be most excited to pursue?
I'm thinking.
Got it.
So I think that what I would do, and I'm trying to kind of do something a little like that. I'm trying to write a book on the Irrawaddy River, that is the great river of Burmese culture, right? Runs throughout the country, and the reason I want to do that is that I think what we've done to rivers is a good metaphor for what we've done to the natural world. And so you've got me on a little diversion, if you wouldn't mind, like 5 minutes of my time. So I was struck by Václav Smil's, he has an article in which he does a crazy thing, which is to try to total up the metric tonnage of domesticated animal flesh compared to wild animal flesh. Think of, all the domesticated chickens and sheep and cattle and so on the one hand, and then the sort of elephants and, alligators. And so what do you imagine is the ratio of domesticated to wild in the whole world? I mean, it's an approximation that he's trying to make, but what do you guess it is?
Like,
Do insects count?
Insects don't count.
1-to-1. 1-to-1.
no,
No.
I was gonna say like
Oh, actually,
10,000 to 1 or something. I don't know.
It's 9-to-1. Domesticated over wild, and that's not counting Homo sapiens. If you add Homo sapiens, it gets to be 20-to-1 because we're the most successful invasive species the world has ever seen. So if you wanted to know what we have done to the natural world, that first statistic is the only thing you need to know. There's only 1/10 of it left at a generous telling. So it's quite extraordinary that everything we have engineered, changed the habitat for, and so on. And so in the book I hope to write about the Irrawaddy River, I am going to try to write it in the first person of the river itself. And I want to start with geological time. So there are no fucking Homo sapiens around to mess up the story for a long time, right? And so I want, in a sense, to tell the story with the river as the first person. I don't know if I can do it. It's not an easy thing to do, and I may have to give up the first person thing. But that is to say, it seems to me that our relationship with nature, and there are a million ways that are productive in terms of getting at that, and the way in which endangered, with the COVID-19, we forget about the question that the world is going to hell in terms of climate change and extinction of species and so on. So it seems to me that this is we talk about an existential threat. That's the ultimate existential threat. And it seems to me there's hardly anything else worth working on, right? COVID-19 actually is pretty trivial, even though it's destroyed all of our daily habits.
Thank you.
yeah. And I guess my question is, I know I can only imagine how much disdain you have for the word utopia, but what are the societies you think in contemporary time that best approximate some version of what you see as being like a good society, or what you think are committing the least sins when it comes to statehood? And then whether those be experimental societies or like large scale societies, and then also what historical states do you see as having kind of approximated those high standards you have for societies and states?
So that's also a really big question. And it's not a question I've thought about actually much. There's, I think someone who said, Oscar Wilde, I think once said, a map without a utopia on it is not a map worth having. That everybody, there ought to be a utopian, right? A kind of vision. Now, the question is whether it's a utopian vision that requires everybody to get in line and beat the hell out of them if they don't, right? March to your tune, right? So lots of utopian schemes come with a kind of uniform authoritarian dictatorial premise to them. And those are utopias not worth having. It's interesting. I mean, if we're talking about contemporary states, I suppose, I'm not very original in that respect, but I suppose I find the Scandinavian welfare states to be, if you're got to live in a state, those are the states to live in, where your life chances are relatively good. If we're not talking about states, then we're talking about the history. I mean, I'm not, as you could guess, I'm not much of an American nationalist. But one of the few things I like about this country is that people like the Mennonites and the Amish and the Hutterites and people who have a vision of what the life that they'd like to lead, as long as people are free to come and go in it. It seems to me that's a very nice thing about the fact that the Mennonites and Amish and Hutterites have, and the Shakers and all of those utopian religious sects had a chance to play out their dream. And as long as it's not voluntary, and as long as you don't have a pistol at your temple, then it seems to me those are the kind of societies, because they are, if you like, experiments in living, and experiments in cooperation, and experiments in solidarity, and I think that's extremely important.
Next up, we have Paul.
Was that me, Dan?
Sure. Go ahead, Nick. I'm sorry.
Yeah, I had two questions that both sort of relate to the previous ones. The first is, in terms of the Scandinavian countries, do you see them as being, given their kind of technocratic attitude and larger range of state services, do you see them as being more high modernist than other states? And in that case, why do you take issue with that when you take issue with the kind of the impact of high modernism elsewhere? And the second is, sometimes in your work, when you talk about things like that plagues are a product of civilization, it sounds like there's an implicit ought there. Not in your work as an anthropologist, but personally, like, how do you
I'm sorry, it seems like there's an implicit what?
ought?
Ought, O-U-G-H-T.
Yeah. I mean, not in your work as an anthropologist, but do you see it there as being kind of an implicit ought there that should guide our action and political thinking? Or do you see it as kind of, purely descriptive?
I think it's fair to say that having trapped me into saying something nice about the Scandinavian welfare state, that they are extremely high modernist states. However, they actually permit a great deal of personal freedom at the same time, and that is, if you have to live in a state, it seems to me that they're better at that balance. So it's kind of interesting when you call the doctor in Norway. I had to do this actually for a semester. You call the doctor in Norway, they don't want your name, they want your personal number. Everybody has a personal number. And so they don't care what your name is. They want your 8-digit number, because all your records are under that. And we Americans find that incredibly offensive, right? That you are your number, or you're like a social security number. And so it makes your point that these are extremely high modern states in terms of their taxation, in terms of their surveillance of economic activity, but they manage to have a tremendous amount of freedom of movement, freedom of occupation, freedom of education, ability to form voluntary societies. So if you've got to live in a high modernist state, those are the states you probably want to live in. The implicit ought. I actually, the question of epidemics and civilization, it seems to me, I guess, I see that as simply an empirical fact. That is to say, no large-scale concentrations of people and animals, no infectious diseases. And that's why the early states that are unprecedented in terms of their concentration of domesticated animals and people have these epidemics. And it's why the epidemics grew in such societies. So in that respect, correct me if I'm wrong, but there's no ought there. It happens to be, and I think, an empirical assertion about the price we historically paid, right, for living in these concentrations of for domestication, actually, domestication of plants, domestication of animals, and just domestication of human subjects as well, right?
Next on the queue, we have Galen Hall.
Hi, thanks again for a great talk. I want to ask about attention. I think I detect in your work, although I'm not sort of well versed enough in it to know for sure. So it's a
You can live a long and happy life without reading my work.
Well, I don't plan to. I have your book right next to me, actually. But it's a tension between densification and the centralization of power and efficiency. So you talked about climate change and, you know, just the vast overabundance of domestic animal mass versus natural. And a lot of recent work has started to show that in terms of efficiency of resource use, as cities, like densely populated cities, get larger, they use resources more efficiently with like a power scaling law, actually. And they also generate more research and development and stuff like that. And so it seems like there's a tension to me in that, at least, because there's kind of a mode of living that is predicated on exactly that kind of destruction of nature, but that also does so more efficiently the more it intensifies or something. So I guess it's kind of a vague question, but I was wondering your thoughts on that tension.
So again, it's not my racket, but you raise the issue. I can ask whether you meant to raise it, and that's the issue of, if you like, environmental authoritarianism, that the only way we get out of the climate change dilemma is to mandate and command certain changes in lifestyle, in architecture, in how we live, and so on. And I worry that that's correct. It terrifies me. That is, I understand that if we all lived in better made buildings, in apartments, and shared the heat and all the central services, blah, 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 that given the actual circumstances of where we are, ecologically, demographically, and so on, I don't see many alternatives to an authoritarian environmentalism. Now, that raises the question, which people don't raise, and I wish they would more. It's another thing, you know, starting a career, someone might, and because it's often used in a racist way, the question of population. So in 1750, the year 1750, there were only 750 million of us. And now we're about 8 billion, all right? So it's absolutely extraordinary. It's not clear to me. What is clear to me, actually, is that the idea that everyone in the world ought to be able to live a recognizable lower middle class life on the planet with 8 billion or 9 billion or 10 billion. They think it'll sort of level off at 10 billion. That's simply inconceivable given the resource use and so on that it requires. And so it seems to me that this is a radical suggestion, I suppose, and it needs to begin with the understanding that eliminating one American eliminates probably more pressure on the planet than eliminating 60 or 70 Bangladeshis, right? So, you know, that's the climate injustice of all of this. but it seems to me we ought to be on a glide path somehow to a population of, I don't know, 4 billion, 3 billion, something that's sustainable. I don't know exactly what that number would be. And so, well, I have a list of people I'd like to begin with, actually, if we're thinning out the population. But without without giving you my list, it seems to me we may be, because of hormone disruptors and so on, we may have so fouled the environment that our reproductive capacities may be staggering and interrupted in a way that will pare down the population. I don't know. Could it be done with a kind of one-child policy without a pistol to people's temple? I don't know, but it seems to me that somehow the question of how 8 billion people are going to live a recognizably secure middle class, lower middle class life, that, as I understand it, and I'm no expert, it seems to me inconceivable. And so there has to be a way out of that one way or another.
Next on the queue, we have Andrew Pearson.
Hello. Yeah, I want to say thank you very much for the talk and the Q&A, Professor Scott, and indeed for your wonderful books. I think one of my favorite passages you've written was about sheep, and the reason they're so easily controlled and prone to herdish behavior is because we've bred them to be that way. And
yes, right.
It strikes me that this doesn't really seem like a terrible bargain for the sheep. I mean, okay, they end up in this very herdish way, but as you've noted, domesticated animals massively outnumber wild animals, and the wildlife isn't necessarily all that pleasant. So I was wondering if there is an analogy to humans and the oppressive state, and if not, where do you see the disanalogy between sheep and humans lying?
Oh, well, that's something I was not brave enough to tackle directly. And so the question is, for those who are not who are less familiar, the argument I made was that I raised sheep for 22 years and sold the lambs to the Greeks and Italians at Easter, and did my own shearing. And being a sheep raiser, I would hear all the time the insults leveled at sheep for being docile, and people who were cowardly calling them sheep and so on. And it struck me that we had been selecting for docility for 8,000 years, and it seemed a little cheap shot for us to then insult the sheep that we created by selecting for docility over time. So the question is, what has happened so that we know that one of the things that changes in domesticated animals is that they're, I'm getting the details wrong probably, but that part of their brain that governs the flight or fight instincts and their alertness and so on, functions at a much lower level. And so, and it has to do, I suppose, with the fact that we protect them in the sheepfold or in the barn against other predators, that we eliminate the sort of competition among males for mating and so on. And so we can trace in domesticated animals a whole series of morphological and physiological changes in brain function and so on that have to do with domestication. And enough so that, of course, they can't survive in the wild anymore. That's the whole point about the word domestication. It means that they depend on us, right? And it is domestication equals control over reproduction. So the question is, what has happened to us as a result of crowding, of the abandonment of hunter and gatherer and forager life? We are, of course, a herd animal as well. But it seems to me that there's I forget her name, is it New Zealand anthropologist or biologist who had an interesting article speculating on what had happened to human beings as a result of our self-domestication as grain growers and as living in large communities governed by states. And I just didn't feel that I knew enough to say anything intelligent about that. But it seems to me, it would surprise me if in the last 8,000 years, there haven't been detectable physiological and morphological changes in our brain wiring, our nerve function, and so on, that have to do with the fundamentally different environment in which we live. It happens to all animals. Why should it not happen to us? But I don't know. Again, that's it's a bridge too far for me.
Professor Scott, I wanted to conclude with perhaps just one more question. Similar to David Scarbeck's question, he pointed out that there was a parallel between Hayek's spontaneous order in the marketplace and themes throughout your work. And another thing that comes to my mind, especially when you were talking about the institutional memory of some of these oral communities, that merely like a sort of folk wisdom was capable of getting protocols that supplemented for a germ theory of disease. I found myself like viscerally in awe when reading that in the last few days, especially in light of how contemporarily we have these huge debates about like whether or not it's appropriate to wear masks. And so Hayek has this concern in his writings about scientism as a sort of like unnecessary elevation of certain forms of statistical measurement and testing and quantification that seems to run very parallel to your discussions about high modernism. And I was just wondering if you see that playing out with, it seems like there's an obsession for data-informed policy and strategies in our present pandemic situation that didn't seem to be a hindrance for the communities and historical reactions that you survey in your work.
It's a long conversation. I'm thinking. One of my heroines in Seeing Like a State, for those of you who've looked at it, is Jane Jacobs. And it seems to me, Jane Jacobs, that for me, her kind of brilliant insight is the fact that visual order does not mean functioning, efficient order. That you cannot infer visual order. I gave the example of our garden, right? As regimented and geometrical and so on. And her example is, the intestines of a rabbit are a real mess, but they do the job of digesting rabbit cuisine very, very, very well and successfully. And other example is the city room of an urban newspaper, which must look different today, and the way in which it seems like chaos, but it's actually working order. And so I thought she had this genius of seeing the way in which people created a kind of order that may not look visually regimented and geometrical, but works well and is animating and is exciting. And so her idea that the attractive places in a city that all people want to be in are those places that have, you know, saloons and ateliers and stores and restaurants, and places to sit and bakeries and, you know, cafes. And it's this mixed use that is a mess and that Robert Moses hated. And that this is, in a sense, the attractiveness. And I think I mentioned this somewhere. It always impressed me. If there was some Midwestern university that was being built as a new university in the last 40 years, in which they were about to lay out the sidewalks, and some architect had this idea to say, well, don't put any sidewalks in. Let's just open the university and see the paths that students make going from place A to B to C, you know. And then after a year or so, when they've worn these paths, we'll put sidewalks down there because we'll know that that's the pattern that people are using, rather than somehow, that's the idea, my anarchist side, that, you know, rather than having the red light tell you when to go and when there's no traffic, right? And the fact that you should stay when the light is red, even though you can see 5 miles in either direction and know that nothing is coming, and you, in a sense, let the red light do your brain work for you. I don't know. I wandered off a little bit that way.
That's super helpful. I just wanted to take this time again to thank you so much for your comments and for taking the time to participate with us. Thank you all to our attendees. I hope you guys enjoyed this as much as I did, and be on the lookout for more internet programming available through the Political Theory Project at Brown University. Thanks so much
for your questions.
Absolutely.